So today, the question I want to take up is when the church must resist. So in terms of resistance, I would just say our Lutheran tradition maybe has not always had a strong tradition of resistance. In fact, those that have said that there's matters for the church and there's matters for the state, and the state does its thing and the church does its thing, the tendency has been not to see the need for the church to resist. It can be found in Luther's teachings. There are the times when you do need to stand up, but that was a question he struggled with, and he ended up one of the darker moments in the Lutheran tradition or the Reformation tradition is when Luther sided with the princes against the peasants, and many people were massacred in that. The Peasants' Revolt, it was called, and this is not to say the peasants were all on the right side, but that has been an ongoing question when the church must resist. So what I want to do today is take a look at the situation in Nazi Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of this, and to look at how the church resisted or didn't resist, as the case may be. And then the question we always want to ask when we look, whether we're reading the Bible or we're looking at a time in history, in this case, Nazi Germany, what can we learn for today from that? That is the question that we want to ask.
I want to interrupt and say that Lynn is really something. Lynn, you are really the guru of the guru of technology. I'm so impressed.
Yeah,
she is a Zoom guru. So
it is knowledge I would rather not have. But yeah, if you go to the chat now, you should be able to click on the handout and download it.
Which I did, and then I opened it with my Microsoft Word, and there it is on my screen.
Very good. All right. Thanks for putting that up. All right. So let's begin. So it was in January 30th of 1933. So you think of, we're in the early parts of the Depression here in the United States, but that's when Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor by President Hindenburg. And so Hitler became the head of the German government. And the key term for Hitler, in German, it's called Gleichgestaltung, but it's basically switching into the same gear of the whole German society. That was Hitler's goal. We want to get everybody going in the same direction in German society. In one way, that you can see where that might seem attractive, to get everybody working together and focused on working together. Hitler's goal was to unite all Germans under the Nazi worldview and eliminate all hindrances to that. So we're going to get everybody on board. That was the goal. It was to encompass every level of society. So there'd be mandatory party membership for many professions. Civil servants were asked to greet one another and strongly encouraged, if not commanded, to use Heil Hitler instead of Guten Tag. And Guten Tag means, it's like us saying good day or hello. And so he wanted to greet Heil Hitler became the standard greeting for civil servants. People were expected who worked in the government to take oaths of personal loyalty to the Führer, and that actually ended up impacting the church, and I'll explain a little more about that a little later. Other political parties then, by the mid part of 1933, other political parties were banned, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, came under Nazi party leadership. So these are all parts of the effort to get everybody working in the same direction. I just want to add a point now, if you're saying, what does this mean for us today? The closest thing in a way that I might lift up from our own situation is the slogan, "Make America Great Again." That was the theme that was lifted up by President Trump when he was inaugurated. So to what extent have people bought into that? Obviously, we have divisions in this country, and what I tell people when they start comparing Nazi Germany and today, Stephen Colbert would still not be on the air in Nazi Germany. He would have been shut down. And I've said this a little bit to be humorous, but actually, if Stephen Colbert is still on the air, obviously things are not as tight as the Nazis were trying to make things tight in Nazi Germany. So
I'd like to add that the phrase "by force" comes into my mind. That this getting everyone to be working together was done by force, and by decree, and by enforcement that was nasty, and we aren't seeing that to that degree yet.
no, I think that is helpful. One thing I will say though on that is it was by force, but there was a great deal of excitement about all of this in Germany also, because it was like, you think of the Treaty of Versailles, and that was humiliating to virtually all Germans, even to the Bonhoeffers. They viewed the Treaty of Versailles as something that was almost a disaster for Germany. And so here you've got Hitler is trying to restore German pride, restore the economy, and having some success at doing it. But you're right, force. So just to give you an idea, in the first year that Hitler was in power, 200 of his opponents were just killed with no legal process. They just, and he really didn't hide it all that much. He just got rid of them. Accused them of being communists, socialists, and so on, and just got rid of them. So that certainly reflects what Janet is saying. The goal was ideological supremacy as well as absolute political sovereignty. So he wanted to try to control the way we think about these things, as well as asserting political sovereignty. It set up an ideological conflict that wasn't apparent to everyone, but between the German evangelical church and the Nazi state. Why would that be? Well, what you find out as time went on, loyalty, as people of faith, we say our absolute loyalty is to God and to Jesus Christ. And so to give absolute authority to a political leader set up a conflict. And then we'll see how that emerges at times. Bonhoeffer was on February 1st, 1933, so this is 2 days after Hitler came to power. Bonhoeffer did a radio broadcast. So we think now of having social media and that, but radio was relatively new at that point. And so that was a way of communicating. And Bonhoeffer did a radio broadcast critiquing what he called the leadership principle, or in the German word is Führer. They called Adolf Hitler der Führer, the leader. And he was critiquing, and he lifted up the danger of making an idol out of the leader. And we have run into this one way, and I'll give specific examples which just give an inkling of this. You may remember in the previous presidential campaign where President Trump made the comment like, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they would still support me. That's making, and that is heading in that direction of making an idol out of the leader. When you, that kind of comment, and some people may have thought it was kind of, yeah, right, or just dismissed it. But there are people where you wonder what could be done to have them change their views. You could also say that of some on the so-called left, that there are some things you wonder what could possibly change their views, what could happen to possibly change their views. But that's the danger when you get that kind of idolatry, is what that is. That's a form of idolatry. The broadcast was actually cut off, and to this day there's still, people are saying, some think it may have been technical difficulties. Others wonder, were the Nazis in such control after 2 days that they would cut off this broadcast? And we don't know for sure, is the answer to that. So in terms of how did the church respond, and when you say the church, you've got about half the people in Germany, and these are just rough estimates, but half the people are Catholic, and so they're subject to the Pope, and you got half the people are Protestant. I'm going to talk mainly about the Protestant side of things. And in Germany, they didn't call it Protestant, they called it evangelical, the evangelische Kirche, the evangelical church. But I'm going to be talking more about that side. The Catholic Church basically reached an agreement with Hitler. Hitler was pretty savvy about these and he reached a great agreement with the Catholic Church, basically saying, let us be the church, don't get in our way doing our church thing. And I'm really generalizing here. And then they said they were not going to resist Hitler. or in that way. Just let him do his thing, we'll do our thing. And that was the agreement he reached there. So a concordat, an agreement with the Catholic Church. The Protestant Church, Hitler's goal was to unite the whole Protestant Church into one church. They had all these different regional churches. So imagine more powerful synods, like we have synods, more powerful synods. It's the best illustration I think I can give here. It's a different setting in a way than we have. But imagine all those, and the bishops are quite powerful in each of these regional churches. And you got to get them working together, because if they're not working together, it's just going to be more difficult to achieve the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve, that Hitler and the Nazis were trying to achieve. There was a law called the Law for Reconstitution of the Civil Service that was put into place in April of 1933, and it included what's called the Aryan Clause. And it basically meant that those of Jewish origin were not allowed to hold office in government or the state. So this is where it gets tricky. The German church tended to function fairly independently, but your salaries came from the state. And so the state would collect a church tax, and then the salaries would be paid from that. In one way, you don't have to worry about whether people put enough money in the offering plate then to whether you're going to get your salary. But the other side of that is, technically then, if the paycheck's coming from the state, the Nazis could claim, well, then you can't be Jewish and be a pastor in this German, even Protestant church.
Pastor?
Yeah.
How many years or hundreds of years after the separation of church and state was decided here is this happening?
Well, that's a whole nother topic, but I would argue that the term separation of church and state is not a very accurate term to describe even what we have here. The concern of the founders in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and that was that the government will not establish one church as a state church. And that was a reaction, in a sense, towards some of what happened in Europe, where you didn't have.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, we don't have the state paying pastors.
No, that's how it was set up, so that the government is not going to be establishing one like the Lutheran Church as the Church of the United States. We just don't do that.
I want you to understand how ignorant I am. How many centuries difference is there? That was in the 1700s.
Yeah, well, you think of, it's the late 1700s is when our Constitution is adopted, and when you don't establish it.
This is the 1930s.
Yeah, and this is in the 1930s.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep, you bet. So what the German Bonhoeffer and others, and Bonhoeffer, even though he's a young man, he became a key voice. He's not the one running the Protestant church, though. It's important to remember that. He's a young man. He's in his 20s, mid-20s. But there was a racial test then, and the idea was that the German church should be German. So no Jews allowed, so to speak. And so no pastor of Jewish origin. Bonhoeffer objected to that and warned people in the church that we can't settle for this. Bonhoeffer wrote an article or an essay in that spring of 1933, so shortly after Hitler came to power, on the church and the Jewish question. And he made this argument that we can't accept this. This is wrong to identify a group by race that's not welcome in the church, and taking people from that group, they're not allowed to be leaders in the church. He warned that the church doesn't necessarily have privileged knowledge of where history is going, but we have something to say here. And so he identified, and this is a critical point, because this may really help inform us in our own thinking here in our situation. He said there's three possible actions of the church in response to state injustice, when the state is doing something unjust. One is to question whether the state is fulfilling its own responsibilities. So one way would be by providing too little law and order, so not protecting a certain group of people and so on. And then the other way would be to have too much law and order where there's overuse of force, which gets in the way of the church being able to fulfill its primary task of proclaiming In the case of the church, the message of the gospel. So you look at some of the groups, if you apply this to our own situation, there are certain groups of people that have had their rights infringed, and that's not just true of this time. It's been a challenge for us throughout our American history, where certain groups get identified and have their rights taken away, but it has been quite prevalent in our time. So that's one, another way to put that is, when we see the state or government not doing its job that it's supposed to, we don't take over the job. That's not our role, but we name what we see going on. Now, at the same time, we recognize that there will be people who are members of the church who may be politicians and so on, and so they have a responsibility to be political leaders, and their faith is going to inform how they do that. Here in Oregon, for Lutherans, one of the most prominent examples is Jeff Merkley. So Senator Merkley is a member of Central Lutheran Church in Portland. I would love to have him sometime speak to us on how his faith informs how he functions as a political leader. I think that would be a wonderful topic, but obviously he's pretty busy right now and will be for the foreseeable future. So then a second thing, the possible action, is to aid the victims of state action, whether they're Christian or not. That's simply not the concern whether they're Christian or not, it's are they in need. So for example, some of the things that we have been doing for undocumented or immigrants, if people don't have enough food, we raise food. So all those kinds of projects that we engage in are trying to help those that somehow are falling through the cracks or not, their needs are not being attended to by government in the way we might expect. The third possible action, Bonhoeffer calls seizing the wheel of the state. Means if the state is out of control, it may be necessary for the church to step in and find some way to try to bring control and keep things from going completely off the rails, so to speak. Bonhoeffer actually talked in this essay that this was an example of direct political action. So it's taking direct political action. And he said it must be decided by an evangelical council. So he imagined church leaders getting together to discuss this and decide whether, what to do. The clearest example of this in Nazi Germany was in 1934. The Barmen Declaration was issued. And the real issue there was, it was a strong statement against the Nazi inroads into the life of the church. So the Nazis were getting too involved in the inner workings of the church. And so the church and approximately a third to a half of Protestant church leaders ended up supporting this, what's called the confessing church, and taking a stand against these Nazi inroads. Bonhoeffer was concerned because he thought this should also include some statement about the Jews, and there was not anything in that statement about the Jews. And again, that was for political reasons. Thought that would bring too much, many thought that would bring too much negative attention to the church to make the Jewish question the focus of that statement. But it's called the Barmen Declaration. It's an example of a status confessionis, which is when something unessential has been made essential. You have a status confessionis, and that's why Bonhoeffer thought the question about the Jews should be in there. He was part of what sometimes are called the young radicals. He was a little too far out in front of everybody, and so they didn't buy that. The key point of the Barmen Declaration, though, is to declare that Jesus Christ is the Lord of all areas of life. And the church's message and ordinances are not to be subordinated to a dominant ideology or a set of political convictions. So you don't take a subordinate position. And the state can never become the single and total order of life. The church is not to become an organ of the state. That was the key there. It was a strong statement, resisting the Nazi inroads into the life of the church, but not, as I said, there wasn't one word about the unjust treatment of the Jews. Then one more thing I want to say, Bonhoeffer is well known by many because of his involvement in the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. He gets involved in that later. And and as the war was beginning, and in that time period, he gets involved with that. Getting involved in conspiracy is an extraordinary action. It's beyond any of the three possibilities he lifts up in this church and the Jewish question. For one thing, it can't be a public action, so you're not going to call a council together. Imagine if I called a council and said I wanted to go and assassinate somebody, and I asked church leaders to. You're just not going to announce that, obviously. So it's just, that's where you're beyond anything that would have been thought that a Lutheran pastor should be involved in. There was no basis for Bonhoeffer to get involved in a conspiracy attempt to assassinate Hitler. And Bonhoeffer himself said, you know, we're still killing somebody, so the point is not to justify what I was doing. Mary.
Was he, how many were with him in that conspiracy to assassinate Hitler?
Of actual people involved in the conspiracy, a relatively small group. And I say that because his brother-in-law was one of the masterminds. His brother-in-law had actually worked in the Nazi government, had had a whole collection of documents to expose Nazi atrocities once they were finally out of power. But his brother, they had to get some military people involved. Bonhoeffer has actually made a double agent or a spy in the 40s. That's how that was his role, was to communicate with through church leaders from other nations, communicate with Allied leaders. But it was a relatively small group. And there's one guy named Father Delp from the Catholic side that was a little bit like Bonhoeffer, but for a church leader to be doing something like that, just no precedent whatsoever there. And I think we would frown on it here too. It's just not what church leaders are supposed to be doing, right? I mean, I don't think I'd last too long if I got involved in something like that. Luann.
I think it's also important to recognize that one of the actions that President Trump is doing is to try to help people, make people think that the church will go away if we don't elect him.
Yeah.
And so your comment about, kind of that statement is that that came from this group that Bonhoeffer was in is, I think we need to be able to say, we still have the ability to worship as we wish, and no matter who we elect.
Yeah. And we still, again, it's very important. Yes, there can be some correlations, but when we make too easy, the point is, I'm still look what I'm doing this morning. I can actually teach a class like this. And I doubt that anybody is going to come and arrest me this afternoon. In Nazi Germany, it got to the point, Bonhoeffer himself was actually silenced, where he was not to preach or teach. Now, he still managed to do some things and get some writings out in that, but that simply wasn't permitted. And so that was a real challenge. And then, so it's the church there may have silenced themselves more than they needed to. At times, that was Bonhoeffer's feeling, but you could just get arrested and be sent to a prison camp and maybe lose your life. And imagine if your family's well-being is at stake. I'm very careful about throwing stones at pastors in Nazi Germany. It's just, again, when your life and your family's well-being is on the line, you can understand where they're going to be somewhat hesitant. One of the reasons Bonhoeffer said that he was hesitant to get married was because of some of the things he was involved in too, because he didn't want to put his, and he ends up, we'll talk, next session, we're going to be talking about telling the truth. Very interesting to see somebody like Bonhoeffer lying through his teeth when he gets interrogated, but he's doing it to protect his family. And people he knows, he's trying to protect them, so it gets very tricky in situations like that. But silence in our situation where we haven't been silenced, that's a whole nother kind of thing. So we need to name the things that we that we're concerned about, name where people are not being treated in the way they need to be treated. So the importance, I just want to say a word about the importance of context on the church's response. In a sense, I've started getting to that with what we just talked about. We need to be aware that there are so-called ordinary situations and extraordinary situations. Okay? So in an ordinary situation, the role of the church is to discern the relationship, our proclamation to the state, to the economy, and so on. So we're always like, what are the implications of what we're preaching and teaching for our lives and for the life of our society, a nation, world, and so on. Part of that is to name sin as sin. So there's a ministry of correction and improvement. By the way, that can go both ways. We also need to, it's not just looking out there. You know, we need to be able to be self-critical about the church and what we're doing. Christians in public office, so somebody like Senator Merkley has a special responsibility to discern God's intentions in the particular institutions they're working in. All these senators right now, if they are people of faith, we would say they have a responsibility to figure out what that means for how they're going to proceed in dealing with something like nominating another justice for the Supreme Court. You know, what insights are there how might faith impact that? Is one of the questions they would need to consider. The goal is never for the church to establish a Christian state or a Christian economy, but to participate in forming a responsible state and a responsible economy. So again, I hope this doesn't get me in too much trouble. The main task of the church is not to make Christians. The main task of Jesus was sent into the world to help us become the people that God created us to be. And all of this, the drama that we read about in terms of the biblical drama and the whole drama of history, is about God working with people and trying to help us become the responsible people, responsible community that we're meant to be. And so that's how we work. When we're working in the public realm, how do we become responsible people, and how do we become a responsible community and care for others and ourselves and others in the way God intends. That's the ongoing challenge for us. Now, in extraordinary situations, there are times when the church is a minority. We get a taste of this here in Oregon, where not just the church, but faith communities tend not to dominate in the way they can in some other parts of the country. But a minority situation might be where you just don't have power. A minority. So think of some countries where Christians just don't have much power, where they're not directly responsible for what's happening in that particular country. And the responsibility there might be to be obedient under suffering and, you know, be the church. You have much more careful discipline within the community, because you got to, when you're in a true minority situation, more extreme, you got to be careful about who's part of the community, and you got to know who you're dealing with here. Because, for example, Nazi Germany, there were people that would infiltrate church services and just listen for who you prayed for. And if you prayed for the wrong people, that could have consequences for that particular community of faith, or especially for the leaders of that community. Bonhoeffer, by the way, once it came out that he had been one of the conspirators, even the confessing churches, the church he was a part of, left him out of the prayers. They didn't want to pray for him anymore. So Bonhoeffer was not, it's not like everybody was cheering him on once they found out that he'd been involved in a conspiracy. Then another situation is where the church is co-opted by the state, and Nazi Germany's, that was the danger there for the church getting co-opted. And in such a situation, when the church is co-opted, it may be necessary for some people to step out and engage in some extraordinary actions, and Bonhoeffer was one of those. Very difficult to figure out our task and fulfill it in a situation where it feels like the church or Christians have been co-opted. We're really struggling with that in our country right now. And we can get co-opted not just by the president and his administration, we can get co-opted by various groups that are fighting for this or that. And so how do we work without getting co-opted? That's an ongoing challenge for the church. The one similarity between a church in a minority situation and a co-opted church is the state and the government basically are hindering our ability to carry out our basic task of proclaiming the gospel in word and deed. So that's the similarity there. In an extraordinary situation, the key question is, does the government permit the church to carry out its primary task without hindrance? You could see where, in some ways, we've hit some of those situations where we may feel called to do this, but if we do that, there are going to be at least public chastisement from some of the political leaders. You're getting involved in things you shouldn't be involved in. That's not the church's job. And we may even have that coming from within our own communities of faith, because we may not be of one mind on certain things in terms of what the church should be about. Then I want to make one last comment here, and then we'll have a few more minutes for conversation. One of the dangers I've seen is, especially the people that tend to be more zealous and really get into working on a particular issue because they're concerned about the poor or the undocumented or whatever group of people it may be. There is a tendency to up the ante too quickly and conclude that we're in an extraordinary situation when more ordinary actions would be called for. So right now, the most ordinary basic action that every citizen in the United States needs to take is do our homework and get ready to vote. We can vote. Nazi Germany, voting became irrelevant after about 6 months to a year. That simply wasn't a way to, that wasn't going to help there. That wasn't an option. It still is here, even if there's flaws with the voting system. We've got people suppressing the vote, worrying about mail-in voting, all of this, that's all part of the process. We're not dealing with a perfect process, but in our context, I would still argue that making sure people vote is essential. Now, after that, we'll have to see what happens after the vote. It's possible that the situation could change and it might become a more extraordinary situation. But right now, in terms of, if we can somehow get people to vote and have as fair a vote as we possibly can, you've got EcoFaith and others lifting up a just vote and so on. That's what we need to be focusing on. I think right now, that is a primary responsibility. And so the church, we don't even have to tell people how to vote. Do your homework and vote. That's the message. Do your homework and vote. And homework includes everything that goes into preparing us to be good voters. And I would lift up one last thing here. In Oregon, we've been doing mail-in voting for many years now. And one of the reasons I prefer that way, I love the ritual of going to the voting booth. I actually like that, so I miss that. But I love being able to sit at my kitchen table and be thoughtful about all the different things we're voting for. And if I say, I'm not really sure here, I can take some time to do that. Whereas in a voting booth, you really got to get the job done when you go in there. So that's one of the reasons I would lift up mail-in voting as a positive thing. Not everybody obviously would agree with me, but I think it allows us to be more responsible voters and citizens. So these are the kinds of things that we as people of faith can weigh in. Why is that important? Because we want people to be able to be responsible in carrying out their responsibility as a citizen. That's basic to who we are as people of faith. All right, let me open it up. Other comments, questions that you want to lift up? Mary.
I'm going to go back to the co-opting. That was interesting to me. And it almost seems like either the evangelical church as a whole, the white evangelicals, have been co-opted by this government, or they have co-opted the government for themselves or something. There's something going on there.
Yeah. No, and interesting enough, by name, we're an evangelical church. I would suspect there are many evangelicals who don't think we have a right to even have that name. Evangelical comes from the Greek word evangel, which means gospel. And we are, at our best, we are to the gospel-centered church to the core. Now, what the implications are of that, that's where you have obviously some differences here. But Again, that would be a whole nother session maybe, but a table talk, but what's going on there? What are the ways that the co-option has gone both ways, maybe in that, and then we also want to look, are there any ways we've been co-opted too? No, I think you're right, something's going on. Other comments, questions? And if somebody's on you can just speak up too. If I'm not recognizing you, just go ahead and unmute and speak up. Pastor Robin.
Thank you. I hadn't wondered about this until your session today, but this concept of extraordinary time. Yesterday at the Synod Day of Learning, we heard a presentation on the doctrine of discovery and how the church's teaching had been used and continues to be used to set legal precedent that basically allies the church with country in committing genocide in all kinds of different forms. And then also we have issues of systemic racism that have continued in our country for 400 years. They haven't looked exactly the same, but a lot of folks in our community have read books about how basically the nature of what that systemic racism looks like changes over time, but it has continued for 400 years. So I hadn't wondered about this before, but are there ways in which within a society at times, some folks, say like myself, who has a lot of privilege in this society as a white-skinned person, don't see it as an ordinary time, but others, say indigenous communities who were following the Christian tradition much earlier on would say, oh my gosh, we are being exterminated. This is an extraordinary time. Does that happen? And how do you think about those kinds of situations? And what about, the call for Black Lives Matter right now, even, before issues around the pandemic and the current administration, how did those concerns come into the thinking about extraordinary times?
Yeah, the couple things I'll respond to this. And again, discerning when you're in an extraordinary situation, that's part of the challenge. I mean, that is, and so, and I, in one sense, we can offer thoughts on that, but there may be people who just say, this is an extraordinary time. I would say, so from what I laid out here, obviously part of the job is to name the sin, so to speak, or name the injustice or the racism, whatever it is. So I was part of that session yesterday on the doctrine of discovery. And what I felt Professor Woodley was doing there, who has been taught at George Fox, is Native American, taught at George Fox for many years. But he was giving us, a basic introduction to the consequences of this doctrine of discovery where, and the church supported this in many cases, where if we discover something, think of Christopher Columbus, we discover it, it's ours. That's well, just what he did yesterday in a very gracious way, actually, it seemed to me, was to name the sin and expose it. Now, we might hope that naming the sin, whether it's racism or this doctrine of discovery or whatever, that we would wake up, become better educated, and change our ways. That would be the hope. In an ordinary situation, more ordinary, that would be the hope. I think there's some people, in terms of the people out protesting in the streets, are saying, wait, enough, just educating isn't enough right here. We need to dramatize this. And so that's another step that's been taken. If people choose, and Martin Luther King Jr. ran into this even back in his time, there were some that said the time for nonviolent resistance is over. What we need is violent overthrow. Then you'll start stepping into a whole nother level of resistance. And I would say that's from what I'm presenting here, Bonhoeffer's involvement in a violent overthrow. He wasn't the one who was going to pull the trigger, but he was involved in a violent overthrow, and he recognized that it was violent. And there was no obvious basis to justify what he was doing. He could tell us why, give an account of what compelled him to do that, but he couldn't do that. So I sense that with some of the protesting we've had, that there is a sense for people saying, ordinary education isn't getting the job done, we need to go another step there. It's still maybe, in our context, we're supposed to be able to peacefully protest, so it's still ordinary in that sense, that it's a right we have. But you do have people, and the president included, just calling these protesters out like they're violating, norms. And so you've got to battle over that. And then if you get the government trying to suppress protesting like that, then the situation starts heating up even more. So, but anyway, I can see why some are saying 400 years. It's, what do we need to do here? What do we need to do? And there's no formula for extraordinary situations. That's the other thing I lift up. There's no, you have to find your way. Janet.
I'm interested in something you said, which is our absolute loyalty is to Jesus Christ and the Christian faith, in combination with part of the Barmen Declaration that said Jesus Christ is the Lord of all areas of life. I wonder if now in 2020, we should be thinking about rephrasing those a little bit and saying something like, instead of our absolute loyalty is to Jesus Christ and the Christian faith, something like our absolute loyalty is to God and our faith in God, and something like the God of love is the authority for everything in life, or the pattern for everything in life, and going easy on the Jesus Christ part and the Christian part, because we don't lose anything. We don't lose anything. We believe in the Trinity. If we say God instead of Jesus Christ, we're still saying the same thing, because we believe in the Trinity, and Jesus Christ is still in there. So is the Spirit. Plus, it puts us in a position to be less troublesome or even offensive to other people who are more and more a part of our culture and our neighborhoods.
No, that's very insightful, Janet. So the context in which that Barmen Declaration was issued, virtually the whole country was identified themselves as Christian. Okay, so that was so in that context, they're trying to make a strong statement against, basically Hitler is not the Lord of the church. Who's the Lord of the church? It's Jesus Christ. In our context, I do think we have to be able to, our faith in Jesus obviously will inform us, but I do think we would need to word that differently in our context. I think you're exactly right. And because we're also dealing with, the diversity of religious communities even, plus we don't want to exclude, there are people that will agree with us that we don't want to make give absolute authority to a political leader, even though they may not be devout members of a particular faith community. But we can still talk, and I think that's where you're trying to move us on that, is we need to be able to articulate this in a way that will truly challenge the impression that somehow we're going to give some kind of allegiance, when it could be to a political leader. It could be, the Jehovah's Witnesses don't even like to pledge allegiance to the flag. You can make an idol out of the flag. You can make an idol out of the nation. We can make an idol out of family. We can make an idol out of being an evangelical Lutheran. I mean, there's all sorts of things we can make idols out of. And it's interesting, Luther put a lot of emphasis on the first commandment, and you shall have no other gods. And he said, your God is whatever your heart clings to. And so it's a caution about any kind of attempt to make an idol out of something that is not God. And so as I hear you speak, I'm going, well, that sounds very consistent with, what we were supposed to learn when we were in confirmation back about that first commandment. So it is 10:49. I think that's a good place to end, actually, because that's the common message. Nazi Germany, you don't want to make an idol out of anyone else than God or Jesus Christ. In the United States, don't make idols out of people or things or whatever it is. That's the part. And when we see idols being made, we must resist as a church. And we have to figure out what that message needs to be, but we must resist all forms of idolatry and name it, and also recognize, be self-critical enough to recognize that we ourselves can fall into the trap of making idols out of all sorts of things. Thank you, everybody. We'll work on making sure the outline's where it needs to be and for next week. And thanks for participating. And invite you to stay for Zoom worship if you haven't had a chance to worship yet this morning.
Yeah,
I think
thank you so much, Pastor Brocker. Woo!